Hello everyone, my name is Bridget Squires and I will be doing my presentation on abusive relationships and why people stay in them. Before we begin, I think it's important to define what an abusive relationship is, because this can take many different forms. An abusive relationship is one where one person uses physical, emotional, verbal, or psychological harm to control another. These can be romantic relationships, familial relationships, friendships, work and school dynamics, or pretty much any relationship can become a toxic or abusive relationship. For the purposes of this presentation, and based off of the information from Chapter 7 of the text, I will be focusing specifically on the abusive dynamic in romantic relationships. So, first we need to talk about this issue. 1 out of every 3 young people have been in a toxic relationship at some point in their lives. Toxic relationships have unfortunately become a very prevalent part of our society that many people have unfortunately had to experience. Some context from Chapter 7 of our Gender Speak text talks about how the abuser's goal is to always gain power and control over another person. So, one way or another, this always boils down to someone wanting their will over another person's and using whatever means necessary to get whatever that is. Talking more about the communication side of things, Chapter 7 talks about how the language around abuse is very important and raises awareness. There has been a push lately towards putting labels on different types of abuse and the different forms it can take. This is because putting labels on things helps raise awareness and bring it into light. It also helps people to understand the types of things that they're going to and can better get help from others with that. Communication is also necessary for recovery. No one should have to suffer in silence, and people not talking about their issues is just going to make things a lot worse for them. It can be really hard for survivors to come forward about their story, but it's such an important part for people who are both in or escaping or having escaped an abusive relationship to have resources that they can talk to. The chapter also talks about survivors of these situations tend to blame themselves and unfortunately carry a lot of guilt and shame over things that happened in the relationship, even though it was out of their own control. Another important thing talked about in the chapter is that abusive relationships can happen to anyone, regardless of their gender, sexual identity, age, stage in life, type of relationship. No matter what, anybody can experience abuse, and nothing should diminish the experiences that people have gone through. I'm going to talk about the mental health effects of abusive relationship. Being in an abusive relationship can cause people to have low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, fear when interacting with others, shame and guilt, fear of abandonment, emotional numbness, and trust issues. These issues can also manifest in many different ways and can happen to people during and after being in the relationship, which also further highlights the importance of people being able to seek help. Seeing as it applies to what we're learning in this class, I'd also like to talk about the importance of gender roles in abusive relationships. For example, a lot of men will be less likely to come forward if they're in an abusive relationship because of the social stigma around men needing to be tough, boys don't cry, in that they should stand up for themselves rather than seeking help from others. This is unfortunately a very sad reality that has been pushed onto a lot of people, making people less likely to come forward. On the other hand, gender roles for women can also be used in abusive relationships. For example, someone who's an abuser might use the ideal that women are meant to be more quiet and submissive in listening to a man in order to force that person's will onto another. Also, since in a lot of traditional households, men tend to be the sole provider or the person who's in charge of the financials of the couple, this can also be used against women in abusive relationships, as they will end up having to have financial dependency on their significant other. causing them to have to feel more likely to go along with the will of that person. So now I'm going to talk about why people choose to stay in their abusive relationships. Now, this can definitely be for a multitude of reasons, but these are the main ones I found when researching this topic. The first, and one of the most prevalent, is fear. Abusers will often threaten to harm the victim, their children, or even themselves if the victim ever tries to leave. This can be threats of violent, emotional abuse, or financial ruin, and as talked about earlier, these are always methods for control. Another reason is familiarity. Now, there's a saying that goes around that says, it's better than the devil you know than the devil you don't know. A lot of people in abusive relationships won't leave because they're so used to being with the person that even if it's a terrible situation, at least that it's predictable and they know what's going to happen, and it's better than being out in the unknown in their mind. Another reason is a hope that this person will change. Fortunately, many people with good intentions hold out hope for someone that they eventually will either change back to a person that they knew or thought they knew, or will change into a new person entirely, and unfortunately, this is very rarely the case. Another reason, as mentioned earlier, which really plays into gender roles, is financial dependence. A lot of times, a person will depend on someone else for all things financial and will find themselves unable to leave that person, even if it's a bad situation, because leaving would mean that they would basically have nothing and they may not be in a situation where they can financially provide for themselves. It also becomes even more serious if it's a situation where someone would like to leave with children, but cannot see a way for them to provide for those children on their own. Another very unfortunate reason is peer pressure. Fortunately, especially in the cases of marriage, there is a lot of stigma surrounding divorce, and a lot of people would feel a lot of shame and guilt about trying to leave the person that they're in a relationship with. I'll go more into this in detail in a bit. And finally, another reason is trauma and Stockholm Syndrome. These kind of go along with the mental side effects, but oftentimes as a survival instinct, people's brains will just accept situations that they're in and sort of shut it out as a way to mentally survive the situation better, meaning that person then has no desire for change. Going more in depth into the peer pressure section, I'd also like to talk about religious pressure. Now, there are many dark sides to religion, and one of them is the role that it can play in abusive relationships. First of all, there is the pressure to commit and get married. In a lot of religious circles, especially the Christian community, there is this pressure that people have to get married young and quick, which may lead people to end up in committed relationships with people at a very young age when they may not always be able to see signs of toxicity that their fully developed brains will be able to. This unfortunately can lead many people to rush into relationships that end up being abusive. Then there is the stigma around divorce. This is especially common in older couples. People will stay in their toxic marriages because divorce is frowned upon by the church. So they'll stay in their relationship to either avoid their own guilt about the situation or the judgment of others in their religious circles. Some people justify marital rape using the Bible by using verses about marriage to imply that a husband and wife having obligation to one another means that they don't need consent. This, of course, is very wrong and ignores parts of the Bible about love and respect in a marriage. Unfortunately, this is the narrative that is used by many abusers. In conclusion, abusive relationships are an awful situation that unfortunately so many people go through. As stated in the chapter, communication is an important part of people getting the help they need. People should feel comfortable to come forward about their situations, regardless of their gender, sexuality, or any other factor. People on the outside also need to be sympathetic towards the complexity of abusive relationships and understand why it is not always easy for people to get out of these situations. That is why there needs to be awareness and resources for those in abusive relationships so that they can get the help they need. With this topic, it's important for people to be able to get the help that they need. I have listed some resources here for people going through abusive relationships. If you or anyone you care about is ever in this situation, don't hesitate to use the resources available. Here are my sources when looking into this topic. I hope this has been a very informative experience for all of you. Thank you.